We have a culture of institutionalized victimhood now, where too many Christian women are confused. They feel wounded from the efforts of their fathers to protect them. Really? And I asked myself, what is this progressive Christian woman who is proudly and publicly walking away from the church, comparing her elders wanting to protect her from the evil ravages of the sexual revolution to women who are genuinely abused and traumatized for life beyond anything she could imagine? I mean, I'm assuming she was not sex trafficked. Jen Hatmaker is a progressive Christian influencer with around 1.5 million followers who was interviewed by Time, who reported that she upset the capital E evangelical community because she was a female preacher who supported the LGBT community, including gay marriage, spoke out against Christian support for then presidential candidate Donald Trump, and taught that racism was a scourge on the American landscape that every white Christian must confront within their own lives. The article is a few weeks ahead of the release of her new memoir, where she goes into detail about how she rebuilt her life after divorce, is dealing with the after effects of the purity culture, and why she no longer goes to church. I'm out of the church right now. I don't know that I will ever go back. I grew up under the steeples. My dad was a pastor. I married one at the ripe age of 19, and I have always been a part of the machine. I was a leader. I was an organizer. I was a pastor. I don't even know what church could or would be for me just as a person. My lifelong exposure has left me in a place where I know too much. I have been a part of the problem. She absolutely has been a part of the problem, and I'll tell you why. Welcome to Morning Tea. Hello, I'm Joanne, and I'm so glad you're here today. So I will begin with Hatmaker's comments on purity culture. If you're not familiar with that phrase, it was coined to describe a teaching that came out of conservative evangelical Christianity and was in full bloom in the 80s and 90s when I was raising my five. The emphasis was on sexual abstinence before marriage, traditional gender roles, and the moral values of maintaining sexual purity. So fathers gave their daughters purity rings. There were purity balls, father-daughter events to promote virginity until marriage. It was sort of a covenant between father and daughter, which is where I think it got a bit off track, but I'll speak to that later. But what Jen said was, I was on the front edge of a huge wave of purity culture in the 80s. That was when all that curriculum hit the market. And all of a sudden, there was a way to package virginity and sell it. And it's not as if we were educated in a way that was well-rounded, that was healthy, that talked about anything meaningful around sex, consent, or attachment, or commitment. It wasn't like that at all. It was just shame and fear-based. It became really clear to us that our belonging was predicated on our adherence to purity culture. And so we were terrified. And then we walked right down the aisle and expected somehow a healthy bedroom to come out of that system. I think my generation has been deeply affected by that approach, and we're having to relearn a lot of sexuality here in the middle of life. Time picked up on her attitude and said, "You are tough on purity culture." She had used words like terror, fear, shame, deeply affected. And yesterday, when I was cutting up vegetables in my kitchen, I happened to have on the live stream of Epstein sex trafficking victims weeping, using words like terror, fear, shame. And I asked myself, what is this progressive Christian woman who is proudly and publicly walking away from the church, comparing her elders wanting to protect her from the evil ravages of the sexual revolution to women who are genuinely abused and traumatized for life beyond anything she could imagine? I mean, I'm assuming she was not sex trafficked.
I had a terrible home life, but I was such an innocent kid then. I always did my best in school, and I had such a positive outlook on life. Until that day that I met Jeffrey, I have never been more scared in my life than I was that first time that he hurt me. I remember crying the entire way home, thinking about how I couldn't ever tell anyone about what actually happened in that house. It was really hard for me to find my voice and to become strong enough to speak about my abuse. I didn't come forward until 2019, and even then it was like I was afraid of a ghost. I know that I was just a little kid, but sometimes I still feel like it is my fault that this happened.
Virginia said it best, and I quote, "I have physical and mental scars that will never heal. I have memories that will never go away. They say time can heal, but this won't. I plead to you, whether you're a dad, a mom, a brother, or a sister, look your young ones in the face. Look them in the eye and tell them you didn't stand against the very people who raped, molested, and preyed upon children and young women.
We have a culture of institutionalized victimhood now, where too many Christian women are confused. They feel wounded from the efforts of their fathers to protect them. Really? How about, thanks, Mum and Dad, for everything you did to protect me. I may have felt a little bit uncomfortable, but you know what? I realize you couldn't possibly know what was going to happen decades later in the complex intimacy of my sexual relationship with my husband. I know you were safeguarding us kids from the pain of promiscuity, from STDs, from teen pregnancies, and all the heartbreak with the proper boundaries of abstinence and modesty, which are rooted in biblical values. So I repent. I blame you for none of my anger and anxiety problems when I accused you of giving me a purity ring. And Hatmaker has an anger problem, it seems. From her website, on her About page, she boasts about how she was that strong-willed child, hot, upsetting the ladies at church. Also, one time I was playing Scrabble and my opponent questioned one too many of my words, and I swept my arm across the board, throwing all the tiles against the wall in a blaze of fury and walked out the front door. That's nothing to boast about. These deconstructionists, ExVangelicals, whatever, they seem to be rather self-indulgent. But there's a profound difference between those who experienced real trauma, like abuse and sex trafficking, and those who simply feel uncomfortable or a bit anxious about how they were raised. It's really shocking. It's offensive for them to equate those experiences with actual victimhood, which seems to be what Hatmaker is doing with words like terror, shame, and fear. And here's a part of the problem. I just got this dropped into my email this morning from George Barna of the Cultural Research Center. Only 14% of self-described Christians hold a biblically consistent theory of sin. While most adults acknowledge that sin exists, many reject the truth that all have sinned and fall short before God. Only 52% of adults say they themselves are sinners, including just 2/3 of professing Christians. 1/3 of adults say everyone else sins, but they personally do not. Even among born-again Christians, 1 in 4 refuses the sinner label, and 70% of people say they are basically good at heart. We're not sinners, we're good at heart. Well, then I suppose what's left when dealing with your own sin is to just become victims. Actually, younger and maybe more mature women, such as Louise, who is a secular feminist, have been reevaluating traditional values around sex, such as, well, let's see here, abstinence, monogamy, marriage, core values of the purity culture, and they are adopting them. In this interview from about a year ago, the dark truth of the sexual revolution.
I think that the neatest way of understanding the ideology of the sexual revolution is the rejection of traditional sexual norms. The idea that we can just throw them out the window and have one very simple rule, which is that everyone should be able to consent, and then apart from that, you sort of make it up as you go along. And I think what we've discovered is that that doesn't work. That actually, there was a line actually a reader sent to me from all places from a book about winemaking. It would be a very politically explosive thing to say in any other context, but in a book about winemaking you can say it, and the line was, traditions are experiments that worked. Mm-hmm. And I think what we've found from having rejected all of the sexual norms and laws of the past is that they were there for a reason.
Yes, the traditional norms were there for a reason, and parents from the purity culture days knew those reasons and did what they could to guide their children in the proper path.
And I mean, I argued very strongly in my book and in my work that the winners of the sexual revolution have not been women in general, maybe some individuals, you know, I think some individual men have definitely done well out of the sexual revolution, although not all men. You know, it's a complicated story when we're talking about men and women, but I think what's clearly true is that the great losers of the sexual revolution have been children.
She's so right. The losers are the children. Decades down the road, we have so much data that shows the relative safety of the biological family with mother and father committed in marriage for life. Any living arrangement less than that sees a proportionate increase in abuse and abandonment, with children suffering mental and emotional problems, they have lower grades, they have lower aspirations, they're more likely to drop out of school, more likely to commit crimes. Today in the United States, we have 1 in 4 children who are in single-parent households, 80% with the mother. For the boys, this lack of father involvement is the single biggest predictor of suicide, of not graduating high school. Boys are far more likely than girls to suffer from ADHD. Over 90% of males in prison are father-deprived. 98% of mass shooting perpetrators in the US since 1966 have been male.
And the thing that I continually find from talking to women who have tried their darndest to have sex like men, to pretend that these differences don't exist, is that it makes them utterly miserable. 99% of the time it makes them utterly miserable. I'd say the same thing. I mean, I always think that something a friend told me about someone he knows who decided with his wife to experiment with polyamory, right, having multiple partners, having convinced themselves that all this monogamy stuff was just old-fashioned nonsense, whatever, who cares. And the first time his wife had sex with another man, and he knew that this was what was happening, he found himself vomiting on the floor of his bathroom because he had tried so hard to override his supposedly socialized ideas about monogamy and so on. He tried so hard to override them, and actually in the end he couldn't, literally at a gut level, he couldn't do that.
So Louise is now married with 2 small children, and she prohibits her husband from watching pornography. Well done. So where purity culture got off a little bit, I think, is that the evangelical church made an error in their arguing for the moral value of keeping virginity until marriage, instead of stressing the more important truth at the heart of this whole matter, that we already have a first love. Our first love is Jesus. We are in a relationship with him. He's faithful to us, and we in return are faithful to follow him as his disciples, to obey his commandments, and one of them is to keep yourself from sexual immorality. The reason for purity is Jesus, him first, and then purity, if you want to call it that. The Bible just says abstain from sexual immorality, and as Louise and so many other clever young women have discovered, it's quite a sensible thing to do. Jen talks about leaving church. Her dad was a pastor, she was part of the machine. She says, I don't even know what church could or would be for me just as a person. I've been part of the problem, and she's exactly right. She sees the church as a dead machine, not as a living body. She was in a pulpit, and the very existence of a pulpit in and of itself is a fundamental problem of the modern church. But further, a woman standing in that place adds scriptural insult to injury. Church never was and never was meant to be a pastoral show every Sunday with the rock band and the visuals and the smoke and all the rest of it. This is so far removed from the model that was given to us by the apostles, centered around fellowship and edification and encouragement and community and love. The corporate machine that Hatmaker references, according to a very in-depth study a few years ago, collects about $125 billion. 50% goes to wages, 25% to building expenses, and so that's a huge 75%. And those remaining funds are distributed up between missions and programs with very little left for the poor. And helping the poor was the purpose of the collections in the early church. It is a machine. But let's get back to the sinners problem, because another Pew study found that across America, only 3% of sermons even mention sin. Some of Hatmaker's other positions: in 2020, she released a podcast titled A Moment of Pride, where she publicly said she was glad her daughter is lesbian, and she said her greatest regret was speaking out against homosexuality. She said, I wouldn't change 1 ounce of who she is. Not a molecule, not a moment. The only thing I would change in our story is I wish I could go back and shake myself to life sooner. Rosaria Butterfield, the former professor of women's studies, published a response to Hatmaker's blessing of LGBT sexual relationships as holy. And in her article called Love Your Neighbor Enough to Speak the Truth, she ended by saying, we also have failed to discern the true nature of the Christian doctrine of sin. For when we advocate for laws and policies that bless the relationships that God calls sin, we are acting as though we think ourselves more merciful than God is. May God have mercy on us all. Finally, on Hatmaker's website, on her story page again, she says, I still love Jesus, but church is hard for me, and this makes me sad, like I'm missing my childhood home. But Jesus said, if you love me, you will keep my commands. He also said that some are going to say, Lord, Lord, and he will say, who are you? I don't know you. So when we say, I love Jesus, we we say, Lord, Lord, we should feel some of that terror and fear that could I be one of those people that Jesus rejects? I hope and pray that she will consider how far away she has fallen. Do you have any thoughts on this? Please leave your comments below. And before I go, I want to remind you about our live stream. It's every Sunday, 7 p.m. Arizona time. And we are starting on a new series for women on relationships. Now, I mentioned I raised 5. I have 7 grands, and my first great grand is on the way. And I want to share some things that could be helpful in all the different relationships that we experience as women and the difficulties that often come up. So I hope to see you there. And until next time, please remember to look for the blessings because they're all around you. Bye-bye.